and welcome to this Civil Rights in the USA 1865 to 1992 lesson. This one focuses on Native Americans in the period from around 1865 to 1887. You will need with you the lesson notes template that accompanies this lesson. You will find that in all the usual places. It should have been emailed directly to you, but failing that, you will find a link to a Google document, which is in fact the lesson notes template, and you will find that in the description at the bottom of this video. So you get that, and you can either print it out or you can open it and just read it and make your notes on a separate piece of paper. It's entirely up to you, but you will need it in order to follow this lesson. So, without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so you will have completed the African Americans 1865 to 1918 part of the course before you get to this lesson here where we pick up Native Americans. And when we pick up with Native Americans, it is this first bit of the course from 1865 to 1918 that we will be looking at during the course of the next two lessons. So you'll be able to make some comparisons between the experience of African Americans and the experience of Native Americans in this period. Okay, so on the second page of your lesson notes template, you will find that you have this overview page of the period roughly 1865 to around about the 1920s for Native Americans in terms of their political rights, Native Americans in terms of their social rights, and Native Americans in terms of their economic rights. And just as in the study of African Americans, it's important that we consider these different themes, these different ways of looking at civil rights, so that we're able to write a synthesized answer, and we're able to consider the extent to which rights have progressed in one area compared to another. Again, we need to think about the impact of different factors. So the federal government and the military, Native Americans themselves, Congress and Supreme Court. We need to think about what impact these different factors had at different times and how much change there was and why. That's the heart of this synthesis element of this course, that we need to think about how much changed, why it changed, what was the extent of change, what factors brought about that change or continuity. And that isn't different for Native Americans than it was when we were looking at African Americans. So we can see in terms of their political rights, this is dominated by the Appropriations Act and by the Dawes Act. We can see that their status, political status, changed significantly in this period, and we'll come to that in a little bit. In terms of their social rights, their ability to live as they once had in the type of tribal groups and adopting the same social customs as they previously had, that is damaged by the actions of the government in this period. And again, the Dawes Act looms large in that. And when we think about economic rights, well, their economic rights were stripped entirely from them. There are certainly the Plains Indians' ability to exist as self-sufficient tribal groups with their own economic model was obviously destroyed by the destruction of the buffalo and was destroyed by the government's desire to push Native Americans onto reservations. So we will be looking at the political, social, and economic rights in the same way as we looked at political, social, and economic rights when we were looking at African Americans. And we're going to start with a brief overview of this period from around about 1860 to 1870s, thinking about the experience of Native Americans. So in your lesson notes template, you need to go to page 5 where it says Native American experience 1860s and 1870s, and we are going to look at some of these key issues, and in so doing we're going to get a little bit of background of their experience in these first 2 decades of this part of the course. So you can use this template here to help you make your notes as you watch the next bit of the video. You can obviously pause the video, and you can obviously go back if you're not able to get all the notes down at the first hearing of the bit of the video. So here we go. So when we start thinking about the position of Native Americans in the 1860s, we start with the realization that there were about 240,000 Native Americans on the plains at the start of the 1860s who were seen as something of an obstacle to the development of white settlement. And moves had been made before the Civil War to try and move Native Americans onto reservations, and this continued to be the policy throughout the 1860s and 1870s. And this was taking place as there was more and more white settlement in the West. It took place against the backdrop of the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railroad Act and the development of mining and the cattle industry. And as Western white civilization moved onto the plains, so there was a desire to push Native Americans onto reservations away from areas that white people wanted to exploit economically. And so this obviously led to conflict, and especially during the Civil War, when the majority of soldiers were away fighting in the war, it gave Native Americans opportunity to probe the weaknesses of some of the American government's defenses on some of the routes and some of the areas where white settlement was increasing. So we see things like Little Crow's War in 1862, which starts as an attack by Native Americans on white settlers and on white government agents because they are being denied the food and supplies that the agreement that they had before they moved on to the reservation stipulated that they would get. It also leads in 1864 to the infamous Sand Creek Massacre, where Native Americans had been encouraged to move increasingly westward because of the gold mines in Colorado, and the government was trying to push Native Americans away from those gold mines. They were important for the economic resources of the Union during the Civil War. And so a group of Native Americans are moved and encouraged to go to Fort Leon near Sand Creek, and a local militiaman, Colonel Shivington, and his troops massacre 400 Indian men, women, and children, and display really a lot of the naked prejudice and brutality of many people in the West in terms of their attitudes towards Native Americans. But what we're seeing is, if we're talking about civil rights, then we're seeing the ultimate denial of rights, in the sense that we are seeing people murdered, massacred, moved from their homelands. And for many white Americans, this is about moving people who are racially inferior to them away from the progress of civilization. For some in the government, they are trying to move Native Americans onto reservations because they think that this is the best course of action in order to try and civilize Native Americans. President Grant's policy in the 1860s and early 1870s is termed the peace policy, the policy of moving Native Americans onto reservations. And this is going to protect them from the advance of civilization, and it's going to help them to develop some social custom and some habits that might help them to integrate into white society. The reservation policy, yes, is about separating Native Americans from white people, but it's actually mainly about trying to create a situation in which their lives would change and they would become more civilized. And what we see throughout this peace policy is actually a lot of conflict with Native Americans resisting the move to try and put them on reservations. So if we're thinking about what the Native Americans themselves do to advance their civil rights, well, in this particular period in the 1860s and 70s, they are resisting militarily the efforts to move them from their homeland and place them on reservations. That's the ultimate in Native Americans' resistance to the advance of white civilization. The government's policy begins to change slightly in 1871 with the Indian Appropriations Act, which basically says that the government's not going to conclude any new treaties with Native Americans. So in the period up to 1871, Native Americans had been seen as separate tribes, had been seen as sort of almost foreign nations that the government of the United States would make a treaty with. These treaties were no longer going to be made by the government with these Native American tribes, and the tribes would become wards of the government. So as a status, they were not citizens. They were people who the government had a responsibility to look after in some way. They were entirely dependent on the government. So this term wards of the government meant that Native Americans didn't really have the rights as individuals because they were dealt with as tribal entities, and they did not have a choice anymore in making treaties with the government. They were to be placed on reservations. So if we're thinking about their rights politically, socially, they don't have any rights at this point because they are being treated as groups of people that the government has to deal with, but they don't have any recourse. They don't have any ability to conclude treaties with the government or negotiate with the government anymore. And a lot of the problems that take place in the 60s and 70s are to do with the corruption of the reservation system. So you have people working at the Bureau of Indian Affairs who are very corrupt in their dealings with Native Americans, who don't give them the land on the reservations that they've been promised, that don't give them the resources that they've been promised, that cheat Native Americans out of land and out of resources. And this corruption and the problems on the reservations is largely a cause of the cycle of violence that you see in the Indian Wars. So whether it be Little Crow's War or Red Cloud's War or the Great Sioux War, what we see is the government puts Native Americans on reservations and tells them that they have to abide by certain treaties that have either previously been made, or they just put them on reservations after the 1871 Indian Appropriations Act and say that they don't have any recourse to negotiate. Native Americans are promised resources, are promised to be fed, are promised various things as a reward or as a consequence of being on these reservations. That creates a very toxic relationship between the government and Native American tribes, that Native American tribes are dependent on the government. The government often doesn't fulfill its end of the bargain. There's a lot of corruption, as we said, in the Bureau of Indian Affairs and on the reservations. So oftentimes Native Americans leave the reservations in order to try and get food, in order to protest, and this leads to violence, and this then leads to the military being called, and it leads to a cycle of violence that continues. And the 1876 Battle of Little Bighorn is significant because it could be seen as the last great Native American victory in these wars, when Custer is killed by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull Sioux forces. And what this actually does, however, is simply strengthen white resolve to move Native Americans onto reservations. And the tactics that are used in the late 1860s and 1870s against Native Americans are some of the total warfare tactics that are learned by the likes of Sherman and Sheridan during the Civil War. So Native Americans are tracked down in their winter camps. The buffalo are exterminated. Native Americans are hunted down and forced onto reservations. They are starved into existence, into submission, and their very existence is threatened by this approach from the government. So if we are thinking about civil rights, then what we see in the 1860s and 70s is Native Americans fighting to try and maintain their their sense of tribal identity, trying to fight to be able to exist in the way that they previously have existed. And the 1871 Indian Appropriations Act, in making the Native Americans wards of the government, that puts them in a sort of limbo position where they have no rights as citizens, but they are also not treated as foreign nations. So throughout the 1870s, therefore, Native Americans are devoid of any rights, and the rights that they are fighting for are the rights to be left alone by the government. They are fighting for the right to exist as they once have, the right to live as they have for centuries before white civilization progressed and encroached on their own Native American civilization. And so throughout the 1870s, Native American political, social, and economic rights are being entirely eroded and are being trampled by the government. And yet, at the same time, people in the government are starting to recognize that the reservation system is not working, that it doesn't civilize Native Americans, that it's not going to help these people to become more like white citizens. And so there begins a debate about what can be done to find a path to citizenship for these people. And yet the irony is that Native Americans do not want a path to citizenship in the 1870s or the 1880s. This is not what, to them, their rights mean. Their rights mean the right to self-determination, their right to tribal identity, the right to exist as they have once existed. And whilst we see in the late 1870s and 1880s a move to, in theory, in terms of their constitutional position, to give Native Americans the path towards the right of being a citizen of the United States. And from a white perspective, that is a noble thing that is being done, that is lifting up the rights of Native Americans. The paradox is that this is not a right that Native Americans want. This is the imposition of a type of citizenship that is not the type of citizenship or the type of existence that they themselves want to pursue. And so that's really important to understand if we're making a comparison between Native American civil rights in this period and African American civil rights in this period. African Americans during Reconstruction period and beyond were actively seeking to be citizens of the United States, to enjoy the fruits of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, to engage in the political process. Native Americans regard themselves as separate nations that have existed for centuries before the United States came along. And so the idea that they are going to be given citizenship, that they are going to be eventually molded to be like white people, is an alien concept to them, and it's not something that they themselves are protesting for. It's not something that they themselves want. And a lot of the reformers and paternalistic, well-meaning humanitarians who are campaigning for better conditions for Native Americans are still doing this inside an ideological paradigm, which is that the only way that you can be civilized is to be a citizen of the United States and have the same rights and behave in the way that other citizens of the United States do. This is a really fundamental tension within the idea of what civil rights for Native Americans are, that you need to keep in mind as you go throughout this course. The drive to assimilate Native Americans has with it the desire to give Native Americans civil rights, to incorporate them into American citizenship, but that isn't necessarily what Native Americans themselves want. What sums up the sense of despair and surrender among Native Americans as their lifestyle and their culture was destroyed, and their tribal identity is trampled upon, and their sense of sovereignty and sense of who they were as people is being attacked by the white government. That sense of loss and despair is summed up by a speech by Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce when he surrendered in 1877. He said, "Tell General Howard I know what is in his heart. What he told me before, I have in my heart. I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. Looking Glass is dead. Pulhulhutsut is dead. The old men are all dead. It is the young men who say yes or no. He who led the young men is dead. It is cold, and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them, have run away to the hills and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are, perhaps freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many of them I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more. Forever." Okay, so what we're now going to consider is how this government policy began to change a little bit. It began to change in the late 1870s, and 1879 is a particularly important year because of a court case involving a Native American chief called Standing Bear, and because of a changing attitude amongst many reformers that saw that the reservation system was not doing what it was supposed to do to try and civilize Native Americans. In fact, by treating them as wards of the government, as groups of people who had no real status as citizens, that was not going to help the assimilation process. And so the driving force behind the sort of assimilation that came later in the Dawes Act was started in this late 1870s period. Okay, so what you'll find on page 12 of your lesson notes template is this question: how did the events of 1879 change the approach to Indian policy? And you are going to use, in order to answer that question, this short excerpt from a book by a guy called Frederick Hoxie, which it's his first chapter that looks at the appeal of assimilation. His book is about the desire to assimilate Native Americans and how that unfolded in the period 1880 to 1920. So what he is talking about here is how there was a change in attitude amongst the public and also amongst the government about what the best thing to do to try and civilize, in inverted commas, and assimilate Native Americans was. So, what was the best thing that they could do to try and improve the situation in terms of assimilation of Native Americans? And we see towards the end of the article, in a part of it that's actually marked there, that as the 1880s began, a central truth was becoming self-evident. The government's policy was unworkable. The crisis of 1879 was conceptual as well as political. Not only were the Indian officers' specific actions unpopular, but each misstep called forth attacks on an entire approach to policy making. Critics everywhere demanded an end to the despotic and corrupt reservation system. What was the alternative? Well, the alternative was total assimilation. And so this idea of not treating Native Americans as wards of the government, as groups of people rather than individuals, this grew out of this problems that the problems that existed with Indian policy and the criticisms of Indian policy in the late 1870s and early 1880s, and it's that public mood and changing government attitude that was the incubator of the movement towards the Dawes Act of 1887 and all that that stood for in terms of assimilation. So read this. You just look, and you only got brief notes to make. You're looking for the way in which policy changed and why that policy changed, and think specifically about the role of Standing Bear and about the reaction to his case and how that had an impact on the changing approach to Indian policy. So you'll need to pause this and come back in a moment when you have read the material and answered that question. So really the centrally important point about that reading is that the Standing Bear case and then his tour of the East showed that Native Americans that many people thought could no longer just be treated as people who were left to kind of rot on reservations, that they were having things forced upon them as wards of the government, but that actually Standing Bear was treated as an individual, and that this new argument about Indian policy was couched in constitutional terms. Remember, this is late 1870s, the Reconstruction period's just ended, but a lot of those politicians that supported Reconstruction and supported the changing of the position of African Americans were still around, and some of them switched their attention or certainly used the same energies and the same arguments that they had for considering African American rights to think about Native American rights. And Standing Bear's tour and the activities of Tibble and other people who wanted to change government policy were were really important in reframing this argument in constitutional terms. So Native Americans need to be given some sort of constitutional rights. They need to have a path towards being able to have some rights. Now, the important thing is that this is still a process of assimilation. It's still a process of assimilation. The motivation behind policy towards Native Americans isn't necessarily changing, but the method of assimilation and what's been argued about how best to assimilate Native Americans is changing. That's the important thing. But what's also important is that the assimilation process or the extending of rights to Native Americans that was part of the plan of the Dawes Act that we're going to look at in a moment is still assimilation being done to Native Americans. It's still rights being given to or forced upon Native Americans. And so the idea that Native Americans shouldn't be left to rot on tribes shouldn't be left to rot in reservations and shouldn't be left in that position is important because it does suggest that Native Americans are going to be given some rights that allow them to live in a different way, but that isn't the right to live and to have self determination in the way that Native American tribes traditionally had. And so Standing Bear was arguing against the reservation system, but Standing Bear's ultimate aim would have been to go back to a situation where there was no reservation system. What the reformers were beginning to push for was, yes, the dismantling of the reservation system, and that's what the Dawes Act was all about, but not the dismantling of the reservation system and a return to tribal sovereignty and self-determination and going back to allowing Native Americans to live the lifestyle that they had for centuries. It was about encouraging, forcing, demanding that Native Americans would start to live like white people, and they would do that by becoming agriculturalists and by following the plan of the Dawes Act would eventually become citizens. So let's have a look at exactly what the Dawes Act was trying to achieve. Now you can see starting on page 13 of your lesson notes template, you've got some information about the Dawes Act, and that goes over a few pages. It also talks about the Indian Education Program. You're going to watch this little clip about the Dawes Act, and you're going to read that information and the information about Indian education, and just jot down what's the key aims of the Dawes Act, and what was the key aims of the Indian education. We already know in general what the aims were part of this process of assimilation, and then consider what the impact on Native American civil rights were. What happened to their political, economic, and social rights as a result of the Dawes Act and the Indian education proposals and plans that were put in place.
The Indian may now become a free man, free from the thraldom of the tribe, free from the domination of the reservation system, free to enter into the body of our citizens. This bill may therefore be considered as the Magna Carta of the Indians of our country. Alice Fletcher.
In 1887, well-meaning reformers had persuaded Congress to pass the Dawes Act. It provided for each head of an Indian family to be given 160 acres of farmland, or 320 of grazing land. Then, all the remaining tribal lands were to be declared surplus and opened up for whites. Tribal ownership and the tribes themselves were meant simply to disappear.
The Dawes Act was a way to break up the whole tribal structure of Native American nations. Instead of saying you are a group of people, all of a sudden you are individual landowners, you are Americans. And so it was designed to break up community, to civilize people, make us farmers, and to also break up our tribal structure.
In 1889, the same year as the Oklahoma land rush, 2 Eastern women arrived at the Nez Perce Reservation in Idaho, determined to implement the Dawes Act. Alice Fletcher was a leader of the group that called itself the Friends of the Indians, a pioneer in the emerging field of ethnology and one of the architects of the new law. Her companion was Jane Gay, a sometime poet who had learned the art of photography to document their time with the Indians. They had come, they believed, to save the Nez Perce from themselves by dividing up their land and making them homesteaders.
Alice explained what she had called them together to hear, explained the land allotment, the meaning of citizenship, and her wish that the whole people would see the wisdom of the great change that she had come to bring upon them. Still a silence. The interpreter read the law and then sat down and waited. A little stir arose among the people, and at length one man stood up, tall, broad-shouldered fellow with an air of authority about him. He said, "We do not want our land cut up in little pieces. We have not told you to do it. We are content to be as we are." And a groan of assent ran along the dark line of sphinxes as the old man drew his blanket about him. "Our people are scattered," said another. "We must come together and decide whether we will have this law." She told them that there is nothing for them to decide. They have no choice. The law must be obeyed. Jane Gay.
Alice Fletcher immediately set to work marking off the new boundaries on the reservation. The Nez Perce came to call her the measuring woman. Chief Joseph himself came to pay a visit. After his long flight from the Army in 1877, he had been exiled to Oklahoma and then allowed to return to a reservation in eastern Washington, but not to his beloved homeland, the Wallowa Valley in Oregon. Using a new device, a wax cylinder, Fletcher convinced Joseph to record one of his traditional songs. but she could not talk him into taking an allotment of land.
He will have none but the Wallowa Valley from which he was driven. He will remain landless and homeless if he cannot have his own again. It was good to see an unsubjugated Indian. One could not help respecting the man who still stood firmly for his rights after having fought and suffered and been defeated in the struggle for their maintenance.
Alice Fletcher kept at it for 4 long years, trying to divide Indian lands fairly, while fending off whites who sought to persuade her to leave the best land for them.
I'm nearly used up. I have such a hard time here, but I shall soon push through. My honor is involved in getting this done.
By the time she was finished, she had made more than 2,000 Nez Perce allotments, over 175,000 acres. Then she and her friends started east to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Fletcher had been awarded a fellowship at Harvard's Peabody Museum.
In the week's journey home across the continent, we shall have time to review the outcome of our earnest endeavors. But if it has been well for us and well for the Indian, is not for us to know. We can only leave the question among the unsolvable, whose multitude grows ever greater as life goes on.
The Dawes Act, meant to help Indians, devastated them instead. In 1895, the remaining 500,000 unallotted acres of Nez Perce tribal land were declared surplus and opened for homesteading. By 1910, there would be 30,000 whites within the Nez Perce reservation, and just 1,500 Nez Perce. Across much of the West, the story would be the same. Before the Dawes Act, some 150 million acres remained in Indian hands. Within 20 years, 2/3 of their land was gone.
So, I think the important thing that you should jot down in terms of the impact on civil rights of the Dawes Act and the education program towards children is really the important thing that you should take away from this lesson, which is the Indian policy in the late 1870s and 1880s, and culminated in the Dawes Act, began to try and very aggressively assimilate Native Americans. And that was about civilizing them, so educating Indian children so they became more like white children. Now, that was a change from the policy that came before that, which obviously damaged Native American civil rights because it was about genocide, it was about Indian wars, it was about forcing people onto reservations. But this change to a different process towards assimilating Native Americans, towards civilizing them, that came in the late 70s and 1880s and beyond, was, from a white perspective, from the government's perspective, part of a plan to develop a path for Native Americans towards citizenship. So if you think about social and political rights, the path towards citizenship that was laid out in the Dawes Act, the idea that if they worked on the land, eventually they would become citizens in 25 years, this, from the perspective of the government, was about extending constitutional rights to Native Americans. And that is important, in terms of the development of their civil rights. However, this idea of constitutional rights was entirely alien to Native Americans. Many of the tribes wanted to have self-determination, wanted to retain their tribal identity, still saw themselves as distinct from the United States. And so therefore the bestowing of these rights upon them, or the ability for them in the future to get these rights, was in many cases meaningless. And for Native Americans, the Dawes Act and the drive to assimilate them did just as much, if not more in the long term, damage to their sense of identity and to their tribal sovereignty as the Indian Wars and the reservation system and the other policies that came before. So that brings us to the end of this lesson. I hope you have enjoyed it and found it informative, and the next lesson will focus on the period from the Dawes Act to around about 1920 and have a look at the longer term impact of the Dawes Act and have a look at the experience of Native Americans in that period. So, until next time, take care, stay safe, goodbye.